try to fill a calendar based on recommendations. So if there is anything that you would like to hear about, please do tell us in the feedback, because it's really helpful for us to build this calendar of events for everyone. So a big thank you to Emma and Ronnie for coming today, and we will hand over to them. Just going to ask Emma and Ronnie to kind of introduce themselves, explain the role and what you guys do as philanthropy advisors.
Thanks, Laura, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to kick off, and Ronnie will jump in as well. I think we'll be backwards and forwards a little bit. But my role is I work as an independent philanthropy advisor. I have done for over 8 years now, and that means I work with couples, families, family foundations, individuals to support them with their giving. So it's really acting as a guide to kind of navigate them through all the different choices they have to make in deciding how they're going to be philanthropic. Often that's about them I get involved when they're literally getting started. So they're thinking about giving, or they want to scale up their giving and they don't really know where to start, what to do. And it's about coming up with a plan. And that might just be helping them work out their focus, or it might be working out how to involve the family. It ranges hugely. And I suppose the thing to just be aware of is that, you know, I'm one philanthropy advisor. There's lots, and I'm not representing all of them today. So part of the title for the talk today was based on a book that I co-authored with Dr. Beth Breeze that is called Advising Philanthropists. And for that book, we interviewed 40 philanthropy advisors worldwide, because they're all different. They work in banks, they work independently like me, or they work in advising firms, and they kind of do different things. So some of them, like me, work on just the content of giving, and others might be a kind of wealth manager who might also be talking about financial planning, but philanthropy advice is an aspect of what they do. So one of the people we interviewed, I'm glad to say, was Ronnie for the book. So he's also representing philanthropy advisors today. So I'll hand over to you, Ronnie.
Thanks very much, Emma, and hi everybody. I'm Ronnie Brown. I'm the Philanthropy Director with Quartet Community Foundation. We're the community foundation that covers the west of England, the 4 unitary authority areas, hence the name Quartet. I've been with Quartet for 29 years now, and I've done a variety of different jobs, but basically settled on the philanthropy side. I manage a philanthropy team of 11 people, and they cover everything from the grant making side, as I'm sure some of you know, through to the managing and stewarding of our relationships with our fund holders. We've got just over 300 fund holders, and they're individuals, companies, charitable trusts, families, all variety of different funds. Principally, they set up funds with us either as an endowed fund, which is an alternative to setting up their own charitable trust. And that's a permanent fund, and it's the income only that's available for distribution on an annual basis, and that contributes towards different grants programs, and then also revenue funds, which are flow-through funds, which are lodged with us and spent out over a specific period of time. And the range of interests is as wide as it's long. We've got some fund holders philanthropists that want to get very involved in the grant making. They've got very clear ideas about what they want to see supported. We've got most in the middle that are open to advice and support from us, but have some broad areas of interest. And then at the other end, we've got philanthropists that say, well, look, you know what the local needs are, you know the local organizations, you make the grants and tell us afterwards. And our commitment to them is to provide them with a philanthropy advice service to encourage their giving, to hopefully increase the overall amount available for local voluntary sector organizations. It's not about diverting money away from existing channels. It's rather about trying to increase the overall pot available to local community groups. So I'll stop there.
Fab, thank you both for that. So we'll move on to the main questions then. So we've got 3 kind of core questions to cover today. So the first one, why do you think it helps fundraisers to know what philanthropy advisors do?
So I think there's a sort of common myth, I don't know if the people here hold it or not, you can tell me, but that kind of philanthropy advisors, the negative view is that we're kind of gatekeepers, we get in the way, we stop people having a relationship directly with the donor. And so that's, you know, a potential problem of getting in the way between advisors and fundraisers working together. So I suppose the way I look at it is that we're allies and that we're all working to the same cause. So philanthropy advisors like me and everyone I've met, we're interested, our motivation is about channeling resources to do good in the world. So we've all got the same common aim, and I think we can actually be helpful in that transaction. And I've made some notes, so I kind of remember. So I think we can save you some time sometimes. So I will only be bringing a donor to you where they definitely are interested. So it's kind of, I've done a lot of the work already to work out what they're interested in, what they're motivated by, what they're looking for, and then I'm making an introduction. So kind of I'm bringing you someone who, and I'll only do that if I think it's worth your while spending some time on ones working with us. I think we've done a lot of work as advisors on we spend a lot of time listening to philanthropists, listening to donors about what it is that they want, what it is that they're motivated by. So we can help you we can share that insight with you basically. So if I'm brokering a conversation, I can kind of say, look, you know, I love everything that you're doing, but actually what this donor wants, you know, is interested in this aspect. Can you talk about this aspect? So we're kind of helping you with those conversations. We can actually be quite honest in a way that you might not feel able to, and the donor might not feel able to in those kind of transactional conversations. So I might be saying to somebody, you know, can you give me your top 3 priority areas that need funding right now? And you might tell me, and I'll be able to say, do you know what, they're just not going to be interested in X, Y, Z, whatever it is, in a way that a donor might be trying to be polite, and they might not want to say, and they don't want to say no, and they don't want to, you know, it gets messy, and we're in the middle, that we're able to kind of think about both sides. And I think overall, we are often spend a lot of time advocating for the sector. So a lot of the work that we are doing is about informing donors about how charities work, what the reasonable expectation is. We're also doing work around what is good practice in terms of giving, what misconceptions that we're kind of knocking on the head. So if a donor, you know, is saying, you know, I'm going to give them X, you know, £10,000 and I want an impact report every second and I want them to change the world within 3 months, I'm being silly. But do you know what I mean? Those kind of misconceptions, we can have those conversations with them beforehand. So we're doing quite a lot of work where we're hopefully encouraging more giving, encouraging better giving, and kind of challenging some of the myths or the misunderstandings that might be around, that might be getting in the way. So I like to think that we're in it together. You can tell me if you're persuaded.
I would agree with, you wouldn't be surprised to hear everything that Emma said. I think this guiding and interpreting role is really quite an interesting one. As a broker, I feel sometimes somebody described as a kind of dating agency for philanthropy, but what we're trying to do is to interpret both ways. So we're trying to interpret the philanthropists' aims in a way that meets best the needs of voluntary sector organizations in the communities that they serve. And similarly, I think we can interpret back to philanthropists some of the work that and some of the needs that local communities and voluntary sector organizations need. I think there's a kind of headline thing here. Why does it help fundraisers to know what philanthropy advisors do? I think it's because it's quite a growth industry. Quite a lot of the major banks now have wealth advice and philanthropy advice sections to them. So if you're able to work with local friendly philanthropy advisors like Emma and myself, I hope that helps you when you're trying to talk to philanthropists through wealth advisors, through philanthropy advisors nationally. I think the other thing for me is that philanthropy advisors are actually on they tend to be fairly values driven. They themselves have come from a background perhaps of working with voluntary sector organizations themselves. They, believe me, are not doing it for the money. They do actually genuinely believe and act as champions and advocates for the sector and the needs within local communities. And I think often because we're slightly independent of individual organizations, then I think we can give some really good support and advice. And the issue, as I'm sure you all know, unrestricted core cost funding is what a lot of organizations need. Now, it's one thing for the organization to say that, but it's also it strengthens that, enhances that. If the philanthropy advisor is saying, look, this is what not just this organization needs, but what a lot of organizations need. And this ability to, it sounds slightly pompous, but go on a kind of philanthropic journey with your philanthropists and us as hopefully trusted allies alongside helps to get the best of what is a scarce amount of resource. I mean, philanthropy can't substitute for some of the funding that's disappeared from the sector over the past few years, but it can be in the right times well applied and make a big difference. And I hope that as philanthropy advisors, our knowledge of the sector, our knowledge of local needs can help philanthropists to target the relatively small amount of resource that they have to best effect.
Wonderful. Thank you both for explaining that further. And I guess you've touched on this a little bit in that answer, but can you talk over any myths or any issues that you experience within your day-to-day role?
Yeah, I think I'm leading on this one. So I think there's something about power here. So the traditional perception is that the philanthropist sits there with all the power and all the money. But actually, my experience is every single philanthropist I've worked with has genuine reasons for wanting to make a difference. And yes, they have the money, but they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the ability themselves to implement and address some of the long-term systemic inequality that exists. And actually, there's a power that the voluntary sector organizations have. If a philanthropist wants to make a difference to local needs, it needs voluntary sector organizations. It needs their knowledge and their expertise. It needs their ability to address some of the issues that these local communities are facing. So whilst in crude terms, yes, the resources and the final decision-making can often lie with the philanthropist, actually, the ability to influence that, voluntary sector organizations shouldn't underestimate their ability to influence it, because they are the experts in what's happening within their communities and the best services to develop to address those. So I think that's really quite an important thing to consider in that context. I think the other thing is that all philanthropists aren't control freaks, and again, there's in popular it's kind of you hear a lot about how and there's this perception that somehow philanthropists want to have ultimate control. Well, actually, again, that's not my experience. I think there's an openness and a recognition that they don't know best, that they want to be guided and supported, and that whilst they may have an idea about what they want to see, they most importantly want that money to make a difference locally. And just thirdly, on the myth side of things, as Emma said before, we aren't gatekeepers. We're here to hopefully ease the relationship, generate new funding to support local voluntary sector organizations.
And I think, sorry, my dog's just started singing. I don't know if you can hear that, but he's not particularly tuneful, so I apologise. But I think there's a couple of the sort of myths that kind of get in the way, I find, for working. So on the side of, I guess, the wealth industry, so a lot of the clients that I'll be working with will have private client advisors, and they'll be very knowledgeable about lots of other areas around tax and structure and things that and legal that I don't want to get involved with. They have different degrees of knowledge around philanthropy and charitable giving and causes, and there can be a myth in that world where giving is easy to do. So philanthropy is the kind of nice to have, the easy thing, the sort of, oh, we'll just tell the client just to pick a cause and give to it, and there's a lack of understanding sometimes of the complexity and the difficulty that involves, and that can, from my point of view, it can stop thank you, he's gone from singing to barking now, sorry. It can stop the growth of the market, because we need those people to introduce their clients to philanthropy advisors and understand its value, and understand that that's something that is useful for the client, that is worth paying for, is worth having, and it's a complicated area that it's worth having that specialism in. So he's been removed, excellent. And so there's that kind of myth, which I think is the same myth around, you know, charity should all be voluntary and you shouldn't have overheads and you shouldn't pay CEOs. I think it's coming in from that same place, and therefore philanthropy advice is equally not valuable. So that can be a problem in terms of access, you know, having access to clients and it being seen as something valuable. And then the other thing, just to echo what Ronnie says, you know, according to my father-in-law, you know, I am basically helping evil tax dodgers, you know, feel good about themselves. That's kind of what I do. And there's that real sense, you know, that scrutiny of wealth, that criticism of the rich, and that sense that as soon as you put your head above the parapet and say you're going to do something good, you're going to get shot down. So you know, I'm not saying philanthropy is perfect. I'm not saying all philanthropists are perfect in their motives, but I kind of wish some of the vitriol was saved more for consumerism and capitalism than philanthropy. And we are in that kind of hostile space. And so you know, and actually, as Ronnie says, that's not my experience at all. So the people I work with, you know, want to pay their taxes, talk about the, you know, there's philanthropists campaigning to pay more taxes. It's not as polarized and black and white as people think. I don't sit down with a philanthropist and they say, you know, how can I have control over this organization? How can I give to them in a horrible way that makes them feel terrible? You know, it's just not the conversations that we have. They're just trying to work out, you know, how much to give. Same conversations as us. What is enough? How much do I want to give away? How much do I want to give to my children? How much do I want to support them? What area do I care about? What am I trying to do here? Who's in that space? What difference can I make? Am I just a drop in the ocean? You know, all the same conversations that we have, and we tend to other them as a kind of, yeah, evil control freak, and that's just not helpful. It also stops people wanting to get involved and wanting to give and wanting to be open with their giving, and I think it's a problem if we don't kind of challenge that.
Thank you both. Yeah, jump in, Ronnie.
Yeah, well, just want to add that again, a popular kind of misconception is that all philanthropists are super wealthy, and one of the things that we try to do at Quartet is to encourage people to think that anybody can be a philanthropist, that you don't have to have got millions and millions and millions of pounds in the bank, and a lot of our fund holders themselves have come from relatively humble backgrounds. They haven't inherited great big estates or businesses set up by their family. They themselves have worked really hard and done well and recognised and want to put something back into the local community for genuine reasons, because they feel they've been fortunate enough to do well, but they recognise that not everybody else has the same life chances.
Yeah, I agree on that every day when I know it's a separate point, but I know some of you will know that I co-founded a giving circle in Bath Women's Fund, and that's very much about thinking about, yeah, the everyday philanthropists that we can all be, and I think that's important. I think the other myth is that you have to be a white male tech billionaire in America to be a philanthropist, and that just limits other people considering being a donor and giving. It kind of makes them feel like, well, that's not me, so, you know, what can I do? And I think that's the problem.
Interesting, thank you both. So just following on from that then, obviously so much has happened over the past couple of years, COVID, cost of living crisis to name, but a few things. And I guess one of the something that'd be really interesting is any key trends or any changes that you have both seen within this area over the past couple of years. And just to follow on from that, Jennifer has asked a question around whether you've seen any trends in philanthropists moving towards multi-year funding. So whether you could touch on that as well. Thank you.
We met yesterday. We had a bit of a list, didn't we, Ronnie, of trends?
Yeah.
Do you want to pick a couple and I'll pick a couple?
Well, okay. Well, you kick off, Emma.
So on that multi-year giving, to answer that one, it's definitely the case in kind of institutional funders and foundations that, you know, unrestricted giving, multi-year giving, it's definitely happening, and it's happening more. I think that whole, I mean, this is going back to Ronnie's point about the whole shift in kind of the understanding of power. So that is a big change in the sector, and that's for foundations as well as individuals, this understanding of inequality and justice, of the power issues involved in giving, and the range therefore of that is huge in terms of how that's influencing practice. So at the one end, you can look at your Thank Ellie Chase announcement that they're going to, you know, shut down over 5 years and spend all their money, and at the other end, we're talking about working, you know, I'd be working with a small family trust, talking to them about, you know, can they shift their practice towards sort of multi-year grants? Can they think about, you know, the issues of trust and how they're working with those that they support, looking at, you know, can they move from more transactional giving to more relational giving? So the conversations are happening across the whole spectrum. And there are changes, but how much each person is kind of shifting will vary on so many different things and their factors. But there's definitely a great awareness of power issues in philanthropy, definitely, and who's making the decisions. And that also means, as well as that multi-year giving, which is definitely happening, you know, when you have those conversations, it's also thinking about kind of who holds the knowledge and who is the expertise, holds the expertise in the space. So thinking more about, you know, when I'm looking at an area to support, you know, how are those closest to the issue affected and how are they involved, and how am I, you know, learning from them to influence my decisions. So that's part of that whole kind of power package. Ronnie, did you want to say anything more on that?
Yeah, I think COVID highlighted it. So the issue of systemic inequality has become to an extent depoliticized, in the fact that though to use that language perhaps pre-COVID maybe had political connotations, but I think during COVID it was very clear that there are structural reasons to why some communities were disproportionately affected more than others, and I think that kind of depoliticized it. So that is much more in the conversation now that I can have with philanthropists to talk about systemic inequality, and that then leads on to a conversation about it being there are no quick fixes. That the kind of thing that, oh, well, 3-year funding, we're going to make this big impact, we're going to change people's lives, and I think a more sophisticated recognition that the structural causes of inequality are deep-rooted and generational, and I think that's encouraged a longer-term a conversation about longer-term interventions and commitments needed from philanthropists, which plays, if I'm honest, in Quartet's case, to the endowment, which is to say, build up a source of long-term support to make those changes, those systemic changes over a longer period of time. And I think that's been a really, really important thing. I think the other thing that there's been a change in COVID. I still feel, if I'm honest, quite humbled by what the VCSE civil society was able to do during COVID, whilst government was able to pull the big levers. I think we all recognise that if it hadn't been for the small local organisations that knew their communities of need intimately, that we would have had a bit of a humanitarian disaster on our hands. And I think that whilst nationally, quite a few, it became, lots of people shouted about it. Actually, what wasn't shouted enough about was the huge work that was done, not just in the Bristol area, all over the country, that made a huge difference to the lives of people during COVID. And I think, for me, that was a kind of vindication of the long-term trusted relationships that those groups have with their communities, that when a crisis came along, they were there and in place and ready to start responding. And I think that whilst it's not been given the recognition that it needs, for those, certainly the philanthropists I work with, they've seen that, and they've seen the indispensable role that local community groups play. And so in a sense, it's made it easier for me in my role of philanthropy advice to articulate the essential role of local BCSE organisations. I think also, and a greater trust as well, a trust that actually organisations know what they're doing, they just need the resources to be able to do it. And whether it's unrestricted multi-year funding, whatever it is, it's actually based much more on a relationship of trust, having seen what these organisations were able to do during COVID. And I think the other thing is that, and this is a constantly moving feast and has been for the last 29 years I've been working with Quartet, is the role of the state and what constitutes state, what should be provided by the state, what then is no longer provided by the state. And I think there's been a real shift in understanding there, and our understanding of that has helped to inform philanthropists that say, well, shouldn't government be doing that? Well, yes, in an ideal world, perhaps they should, but they're not. And having a kind of real world conversations about how communities need support. And if the state's not going to do it, then BCSE and civil society organisations need to be there to be able to provide that.
I think just to add to that, if I can, I've got half an hour on the time, but that sense that we're in, what do we want to call it, global polycrisis. You've got environmental issues and social issues, and there's just so much going on, and it's all interconnected. So that kind of reinforces that fact that people are looking at that systemic issue, but also what that's driven is a much greater, a massive rise actually in collaboration, which I think is a really positive trend. It's kind of like nobody can do it on their own. We all have to do this together. It needs everybody kind of pulling together. So you see more collective giving models and more collaboration that's definitely happening as well. So I think that's a positive. And I think I work with some younger generations coming into their sort of family giving, and they definitely are very switched on in terms of climate change, in terms of social justice, and also about not being very uncomfortable with having wealth and how you kind of deal with that and give that away. So I think I'm quite positive about what the next generation are doing in terms of being more engaged with purpose and meaning, and definitely having a very strong sense of justice and how everything's interconnected. I suppose the trend that I know is coming, but I don't feel able to speak about is the technology one, which is coming, and I think everyone's talking about how that's going to impact. I don't think we know yet, but it definitely will. But I'm not going to get drawn into a debate about cryptocurrency because I'll lose it quite quickly. I can hold my knowledge for a little while and then it evaporates. But I think we definitely will see changes in technology that will impact all of us in ways we haven't thought about just yet.
Wonderful, thank you both. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. I have a couple here to get us started with, but yes, any other ones, feel free to put them in there. The first one that's come through is around, where do you source or find the local needs of communities, voluntary organisations and charities?
Well, I'll go first on that. As I'm sure quite a number of you know, we've got a kind of open access grants program. So very often it's local communities that are telling us where the needs are and how they're busy responding to them. I mean, in addition to that, obviously there's local insights, which gives us pictures of our local area and grant making that's going on around it with 360 degree grant making. We spend a lot of time talking to different groups and organisations. We are part of networks that are that we take a lot of information from and contribute towards citywide partnerships or community workers or Council for Voluntary Services, etc., etc. And it's a kind of constant job for us, is to try to stay up with what's happening and responding to what we're seeing. But it's never constant, as I'm sure all of you know. It's never a fixed picture that you can say settled,ly, right, that's what the needs are, that's great. It's for us to continually evolve how we respond, and particularly the sort of funding that organisations require, and trying to, as much as possible, work with our philanthropists to shape the funding that we offer in the way that best responds to what we are hearing from groups as to what they need. Moving away as well, and this is kind of part of the trends, moving away a little bit from open access grants programs, where, as I'm sure as fundraisers you know, you're putting in applications and there's maybe a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance of success. That doesn't feel to me to be a particularly good tool to have a conversation between an organisation that wants to address a need and a potential funder. And I think moving away from kind of having to compete with each other more towards collaboration and alignment is something that that I think we're seeing a lot more of. And in that context, being able to draw on other people's information, other funders' information, and not just sit in the silo saying, well, we know what the needs are, we'll respond to them in the way that we think best.
I mean, for me, if someone is interested in giving locally, that's nice and straightforward. So I can say, go to the Community Foundation, you know, that's where they'll have the local knowledge and the knowledge about needs. So that people I work with therefore tend not to just be interested in giving in their local area. They're probably interested in other things as well, which is why they want some help with it. And it depends how broad their interests are, how difficult it is to find organisations for them. So as an example, I was working with someone who had quite a niche interest, and we found there were 6 groups doing it in the UK, and we brought them all together, got them all together and said, right, what do you do, what do you all need, what will help you? So that makes it relatively straightforward. When you've got somebody who's got a broader interest, like, I don't know, early years or regenerative farming or something, then there's an element where you're always being proactive, but you're doing that desk-based research. You're trying to find out, you know, what the reports are saying, what experts are saying, and then you're also asking for recommendations, looking at who else has funded things. So you're doing the best you can. It's never perfect. You're always going to miss somebody, because you could, you know, it's like you could spend forever doing the research, and what you want is to get money moving. So you're doing your best effort to try and find organisations that seem like a good match, so that you can then proactively approach them and then ask for a conversation and ask them what they need.
Thank you both. And there was a kind of a follow-up question to that around keeping that knowledge up to date, which you've touched on already, but also a question around the local giving donation platform that was used, and whether or not there's anything that's replaced that.
I saw the question, and we did offer kind of encouragement for local groups to sign up to local giving. I'm not sure, actually. I know colleagues at the office know better than me about that, and I can find out and come back to you on that, but I'm not sure actually what online platform exists for everybody to be able to put their details up. Maybe others actually on this call might know better than me on that.
I think the trouble is that there's more than one platform, and that's the tricky thing. And so I think Charizone is a new one. There's often some new ones trying to solve, quite rightly, that issue of linking donors and groups. But unfortunately, it's often you want a monopoly, but you kind of do, don't you? So you put your details in one place that can get found once. But at the moment, it's still that there's lots of different platforms, unfortunately.
No, that's great. Thank you, guys. And there's a theme coming out around kind of charities, especially looking at like small charities as well. How do they go around being seen by philanthropy advisors? But also, is there anything that you notice, any kind of common mistakes that any charities are making with regards to information on their website that might stop them being seen as such?
I spend quite a lot of my time looking at websites, and it's the starting point. It's not everything, but so the thing that helps is always clarity, because sometimes the websites obviously have different audiences, and quite rightly a philanthropy advisor or philanthropist isn't the sole audience, but you want an ability to go, what do you actually do and why are you doing it? And sometimes that's not there, and it doesn't have to be front and center, but it has to be somewhere would be really, really useful. We're not expecting, you know, everything to be up to date and everything to be spot on and clear and everything, but just at some place that it's really, really clear what the mission of your organization is and what you're trying to do, can rule it in or out. And it's, you know, the quicker we can find that information, actually that's really helpful. It's difficult to do that. I appreciate when you're a small organization, you're much more concerned with what you're doing, and quite rightly. But the reality is that there are more funders now that are proactively looking, and you know, there's things that are not in your control about whether you come up on, whether other people have funded you and have shared that information, or whether you're in a report, or whether you spoke at an event, or, you know, all those things of how active you are on social media. But you can, you know, if you can just have, you know, almost a, for anyone looking that wants to fund us, here is our key, you know, summary of who we are, what we do, what difference that makes, why we matter, then I think that's probably time well spent if you can.
My thing would be, and it actually relates a little bit to one of the questions further down that Emma asks about what advice to charities working with philanthropists, is that certainly where we are, and it is about local philanthropy, it's about forming relationships, long-term trusted relationships. So whilst websites and social media may be the portal, actually the opportunity to meet with your philanthropist and hopefully the philanthropy advisor will be happy to broker that, is one of the best ways, because I think it is through forming those personal long-term relationships that I think there's the greatest chance of building a long-term relationship, and actually the best chance for you to be able to articulate your best case as to what you do and how you do it. And I think that that's something that coming back to a previous point, don't underestimate your power in that relationship, because you are the people with the knowledge. You have the knowledge of what the needs are. And I think it's really important not to underplay your own expertise, your unique knowledge of the communities with which you're working. And I would always encourage that view going into a relationship with a philanthropist or any funder, really, is to say that you have expertise and knowledge. That's the essence of what philanthropists and funders want to be able to support.
And I think, Ronnie, that's, you know, for anyone in Bristol, absolutely you have that relationship. What's harder, I think, is when you've got, you won't know who the donor is and where they are or what they're interested in. So it's really hard at that point, isn't it, to make the relationship. But I think, you know, if you have got local funders or local wealth teams and private client advisors and those teams, if you can have the time to contact them and reach out to them, that's brilliant. It's hard, isn't it, to have the time to the speculative ones. That's tricky, because I'm just working on my own and I will have a small number. I don't know what they're going to be interested in, you know, and so it's really hard to sort of say to me, you know, come and tell me everything that you do, because until I have a client that's interested, it's not so helpful. So that's where I think you're right, relationships matter, but there's a visible step before that relationship can happen, when you're looking at people that are kind of looking around that you won't know who they are. So it's the hard bit.
Thank you. And moving on to a question from Elaine around reserves. So, you know, charities obviously facing this balancing act with reserves, with charities closing, whilst also the trust introducing stricter criteria on reserve policies. So I guess whenever you are going to recommend a charity, how much do the reserves influence that? Is it part of your due diligence in advance of introducing someone to a charity?
I mean, in a word, yes, and it's a really difficult situation that groups find themselves in, because they're demonstrating good financial stewardship by having sufficient reserves to run. Yet if they've got too much, then a charitable trust or any funder might turn around and say, well, you could fund that from your own resources. And I think it's a really, really difficult thing. And the Charity Commission guidance is only a you know, it's a rule of thumb there. It's not a strict requirement. And different funders have different views on what constitutes sufficient reserves. And so there's no right or wrong answer on that. But I think it obviously demonstrates good financial management, particularly in these times. If you've got sufficient, you know, you've got reserves, you don't want to stop running the services for people you're working with overnight, and neither do you want to, if the organisation has to close, not have enough money to close down the organisation in a professional way. But at the other end of it, if somebody's sitting on 2 and 3 year reserves and is applying for a grant to us for £5,000, we might well say, well, actually, you could probably fund that from your own resources. And
Nearly everyone will look at the accounts as part of the due diligence process, whether that's a funder or advisor or the donor themselves. So I think it's that narrative on the reserves that is the most useful. So it's kind of not that, you know, if your reserves are low, why, what's the plan? And if the reserves are high, why, you know, what's going on there? And I think that narrative text in the accounts is a use. I know it's always out to date, but it's a really useful indicator that you have thought about it and there's a plan. And that's the most reassuring, rather than necessarily looking at a threshold number.
Thank you both. And just to follow on, there's a question from John. It says, in your experience, what are some common areas where VCSE organisations can make improvements to the way in which they communicate with and demonstrate impact to potential donors?
Well, I'll just go quickly on this. I think there's a lot of language we use, and I say we collectively within the sector, that we use as shorthand. And like any profession, we've got the language that we use so we understand each other. And I think certainly from our perspective, often the philanthropists that we're working with have come from other sectors. And so I think particularly in reporting back or in explaining the cause of the issue, to think about a generalist audience rather than a specialist audience that might be reading that. And I mean, we all do it. I do it all the time, and it's actually just really important to sense check and say, well, this is something that's in common currency as a way of describing a situation, an activity, or event. Is there a way that I could do it that would be more easily accessible to a generalist audience? That would be the one thing that I would say is the language used.
And there'll be people who are data driven, and there'll be people that are story driven, and then there'll be everything in between. And I think it's just remembering both ends. So don't feel like we just have to do story or we just have to do metrics. If you've, you know, I mean, obviously the most important thing is the information is useful for you. And if you're therefore, you know, in terms of data, if you're capturing data that helps you, that's the data to be sharing. Rather than having the funder as the audience. And that's the ideal world, isn't it? And I know it doesn't always happen, but I think it's just remembering that some people are definitely want metrics, and some people really aren't that bothered at all about the metrics. They just want to go, what they might be giving more with solidarity about what you're trying to do. So they're not so worried about the impact data, but others are. I'm afraid they're both in the mix.
Fantastic, thank you. And a question's come up around trends again, around kind of, have you noticed any increased trend in people giving towards smaller organisations?
I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer that, just in the fact that local for us means local geographically. And for me, it'll vary. Some of the fund holders we have would like to see that £5,000 go into a smaller organisation where they can feel that that's quite a substantial impact. Whereas Others are very happy recognising that well-established organisations that perhaps a bit bigger are doing pieces of work for which larger grants are made. So it's not one or the other for me. I mean, we make grants to a whole range of different local organisations, and as long as they're local, we will consider them.
Yeah, what he said, put it beautifully. The only thing that I would say is depending on, you know, for small and for large organisations, one thing that is being looked at more is kind of how you're listening to the people that you're helping to understand their needs. So that could be in a large organisation, because there could be an feeling that it's too distanced, and do they really know what's needed on the ground? Smaller organisation, then that's usually taken as that's more likely to be happening. So it's not necessarily the size of the organisation, but they definitely want to know that what you're doing is really needed by, you know, and that's the information that's helpful. Yeah.
And just to add to that, our kind of open access year-round grants program is the Express program, and that we would say typically income of under $1 million, but within that prioritising organisations with an income of £500,000 or less. But that those are priorities. It doesn't mean to say that organisations that have got over £500,000 in income can't make a very strong case for funding to us.
Thank you. And you'll see the most recent question there. I'll read it out for everyone anyway, but it says, is there ever a good way to approach a philanthropic organisation for a bespoke grant? They ask because they're considering approaching Quartet for funding, meet all the giving criteria, but it's to meet a match fund of 30k, and there are currently no funds of this size they'd be eligible for. So whether or not those kind of bespoke requests are worth making?
It's always worth having a chat, and on our website we've got you know, details of who you can approach, and the philanthropy team will come back to you and give you as much support as we're able to. So I would always encourage, before putting in an application call, particularly if you're a first-time applicant to Quartet, do get in touch and take some support from us as to how we can steer you to whichever fund would best meet what you want to achieve, because we've got a lot of funds running at any one time. So I would just encourage that dialogue before you put in an application, especially if you're first time applicant.
Thank you. And one from Emma around kind of what do you look for in a charity when you're doing your research? And you've touched on this anyway, and your research of charities, but is there anything else that you would like to add to that point?
While you're thinking, I'll just
please
just
do. I'm trying to think of how to make it different.
I think it's quite interesting. So particularly for smaller charities, who are the drivers? And I think having good trustees. So I know that one national charitable trust, actually, when they do their assessment visits to organisations, insists that not only the paid executive is there, but also 1 or 2 members of trustees. And I think that's quite a good thing to do, to demonstrate the depth of the engagement of the organisation, because I think that's something is obviously governance and finding trustees is something that quite a lot of organisations struggle with. So I think more and more, certainly I'm hearing more and more people wanting to understand the depth and the strength of the organisation, in addition to the one individual they might be meeting in relation or talking to in relation to a specific application. That's much easier on site visits, and we do go out a lot with our fund holders to visit projects, and at those it is often the case that there'll be more than one member of staff there, just to demonstrate the strength of the organisation.
Yeah, and I think the basic things, there's an element that is about the fit. So it's, you know, that's what you're looking for, because you've got a donor who's interested in a certain area, and you're just looking at, are they working in that way? Are they working in that area? Are they working with that age group or on that issue? So there's some sort of things that are just about trying to do matching. That will definitely be helpful to have my AI assistant to help with. And then there's there is some basic due diligence around reporting compliance and trustees and those kind of things. You know, are they structurally okay? And then after that, because what you want to know is about, you know, strategy, energy, vision, passion, ethos, that's when you want to have the conversation. So there's a kind of initial filter that's a bit clunky, and then there's the actually what are the qualities of the work and what are the issues that they're dealing with and how they're going about it, and that's the bit that is about a conversation usually.
I've just put in the chat just something I should have mentioned earlier is the vital signs report, and I know some of you are aware of this. We produce this as a completed review once every 3 years, and we've just published this. It's online, and I've just put the link on it there, and it's under 10 predetermined headings looking at the west of England, and it's basically taking the pulse of what's happening within local communities. And I think this is something we use with our philanthropists, and it provides a common language. I think often we get this reflected back in the applications that we get for funding, and it provides a common framework for conversation, which I hope is a useful tool. It's more a start point for conversation rather than a definitive snapshot of what's going on. It is from all publicly available sources of information. I just kind of encourage that as a prism through which perhaps to talk about where you're working or what you're doing within those areas. And it's certainly something we encourage our fund holders and philanthropists to look at as a way of helping to shape their thinking around what some of the local needs are. So that might be, we found it quite a useful tool. So I'll just encourage the use of that if it's appropriate for your case.
Thank you, Ronnie. I'll just touch on one final question, and then the other ones we'll send through to Emma and Ronnie after. If there's anything that we can share back, we will do. Just one question around working with wealth management companies. Do you do that? If so, what's your experience? And would you recommend that charities make direct contact with them?
Well, I'll just take this one. So by wealth management companies, in that case, how I interpret that is local independent financial advisors, local accountants, local lawyers. And we do, yes, we go to them quite a lot on the basis that if their clients come to them and say they want a bit of advice or support around local charitable giving, then for those advisors to know that we're around to help their client to think through what might be appropriate is where we try to position ourselves. I'm not actually sure whether a direct approach from individuals, individual charities to these wealth advisors will be. I'm sure people here have had experience of that, so I'd be really interested if they've had some success or otherwise. It doesn't always come up in conversation. This is what I found. Wealth advisor, it doesn't always come up in the conversation, but I think there's a younger generation of philanthropist donors coming through that are more engaged and are asking for more from their advisors on knowledge and information about, certainly in our case, local charitable giving. And I think that's an opportunity and a trend that I think and I hope will only increase.
That's definitely a topic of conversation within all those different professions that it wasn't before. So there is an increased awareness that philanthropy is important to their clients and is important in a business sense to retaining and attracting clients. So that's a motivator, as well as hopefully, you know, the right thing to be doing. I think it's tricky. I don't think we have the data on, and it, like Ronnie, I'd like to know people's experience on kind of how much time and effort it's worth kind of investing in building those relationships, making that contact. What I would say is that are often wanting content for, you know, newsletters, people talking, webinars, things like that. So it might be worth keeping an eye on if you think they've got kind of publications that might be reaching donors, then perhaps it's worth offering some content to them about, with your expertise about a topic, because that's probably more interesting than, I'm being very biased against wealth management, but you know, there's a lot of dry information that they have to share, and you know, stories and you know, things happening in the world that are about people trying to do good is probably good content that they would like. So it might be worth having a think from a kind of content, showing yourself as experts in an area. And I don't know who that reach, but I think that's, yeah, I don't have a cost benefit analysis to know whether that's worth your while or not, I'm afraid.
Oh no, well, thank you both, and thank you for answering all of the questions. We thought this would be a really popular topic today, and it definitely has been. So a big thanks to everyone for asking questions, and also to Emma and Ronnie for sharing their experiences, but also for covering all of those off so well. Thank you both. And then just to wrap up the session, a reminder, a few reminders, just to let us know if there's anything that you want covered in following sessions. We'll send a link to the Vimeo channel if you'd like to watch sessions. There's so many there, from legacies, ethical fundraising, prospecting, to name but a few. And then just that next month we will be taking a break, but we are going to organise an informal coffee morning. So you'll hear more about that, and just please do join us if you can, because it would be really lovely to see people in person as well. So thanks all for joining us, and thank